On January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, the ground along 1,100 kilometers of North America's Pacific coast shifted. The Juan de Fuca plate, which had been locked against the underside of the North American plate for somewhere between 200 and 500 years, suddenly slipped free. The rupture lasted approximately 5 minutes. The earthquake it produced was magnitude 9.0 or larger, among the most powerful ever to strike this hemisphere. The coastline dropped by as much as 2 meters in some locations, instantly and permanently. And the tsunami it generated crossed the Pacific Ocean overnight, arriving at the coast of Japan before dawn on January 27th, where its waves destroyed rice storage facilities and coastal villages, and were recorded in Japanese historical documents precise enough that modern scientists can use them to calculate the timing of an event that occurred before any seismometer existed. That was 326 years ago. It has not happened since. And in the first half of 2026, 3 separate research teams published findings that each pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion. The models scientists built to describe what happens when it does happen again are wrong. Not slightly wrong, wrong in ways that make the hazard larger, more complex, and harder to predict than the previous generation of science described. The Cascadia subduction zone stretches 1,100 kilometers from Cape Mendocino in Northern California to the northern end of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. It is the boundary where the Juan de Fuca plate, an oceanic plate roughly the size of the state of Montana, dives beneath the North American continent at a rate of approximately 4 centimeters per year. This subduction generates the largest earthquakes on Earth. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan occurred on a nearly identical fault structure. So did the 1960 Chilean earthquake, the largest ever recorded, at magnitude 9.5. So did the 2004 Sumatra earthquake, which produced a tsunami that killed 228,000 people across 14 countries. The Cascadia subduction zone is fully capable of producing an earthquake in the same magnitude range as all 3 of those events. The difference is that it has not done so in 326 years, and unlike those other zones, it has produced almost no small earthquakes during that period to relieve the accumulating strain. This silence is not safety, it is storage. The first major revision of 2026 came in April, when new research using updated offshore seismic imaging data determined that the Juan de Fuca plate is approximately 5 kilometers shallower beneath the North American continent than previous hazard models assumed. 5 kilometers does not sound significant. In seismic terms, it changes everything. The depth of the subducting plate controls where the most intense shaking is generated during a rupture, and a plate that is 5 kilometers shallower means that energy is released closer to the surface, closer to the communities above it, and with less crustal material to absorb it before it reaches the ground where people live. Current hazard models, the models that inform building codes, emergency planning, and infrastructure design across Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, were built on the old depth estimates. They need to be updated. That update has not yet been completed. The same April 2026 research identified a second significant revision. Beneath the coastal town of Tillamook, Oregon, a community of roughly 6,000 people on the coast, about 75 kilometers southwest of Portland, researchers identified a sedimentary basin that does not appear in any previous hazard model. This is not a minor detail. Sedimentary basins amplify seismic waves. The mechanism is the same one that destroyed buildings in Mexico City during the 1985 earthquake, where soft lakebed sediment amplified distant shaking by a factor of up to 50. The basin beneath Tillamook was not known to exist before this year. The communities built above it were designed without any knowledge of what the ground beneath them would do when the Cascadia megathrust finally moves. Researchers are currently working to quantify the amplification factor. The directional implication is already clear. Tillamook's actual seismic hazard is meaningfully more severe than any official model has ever calculated. The third revision came in July. A team using data from the CASIE-21 seismic imaging expedition published findings in Science Advances showing that the Juan de Fuca plate is actively tearing apart beneath the northern Cascadia zone. Mapping a massive fault where the descending plate has already dropped approximately 5 kilometers, the plate appears close to breaking through entirely. It is not a single intact slab, it is fragmenting, tearing into pieces, creating structural complexity that hazard models never accounted for because nobody knew it was there. The researchers are careful to note that tearing does not mean Cascadia is shutting down. Subduction continues, strain accumulates, seismic hazard continues. What the tear introduces is uncertainty about how a future rupture behaves, whether it propagates across the entire 1,100-kilometer zone in a single magnitude 9 event, or whether the tear acts as a barrier, limiting rupture propagation. Scientists do not yet know. What they know is that previous models treated the plate as coherent. It is not. Stop for a moment. 3 separate revisions in 2026, each one pointing toward greater complexity, greater hazard, or greater uncertainty than the previous model described. And the underlying clock has not stopped. 326 years of accumulated strain is still there, still building at 4 centimeters per year, still waiting for a surface to slip. Now add the Seattle Fault Zone. Research published in May 2026 in GSA Bulletin examined the network of faults running directly beneath Seattle and its surrounding communities, a different fault system from the offshore subduction zone, but one that interacts with it. The findings revealed that these local faults are rupturing more frequently and producing larger events than the National Seismic Hazard Model had assumed. Lead author Stephen Angster, a USGS research geologist, stated it plainly: the faults are rupturing more frequently and pretty close to home. He noted that the Seattle Fault Zone accounts for roughly 15% of total strain across the Pacific Northwest, and that a major event on the Seattle Fault might, for Seattle itself, be more immediately destructive than the Cascadia megathrust offshore. The local fault is closer, its shaking is more concentrated, and it was not adequately represented in the models used to build Seattle's infrastructure. Seattle has 750,000 residents. The greater Seattle metro area has approximately 4 million. Portland's metro has 2.5 million. Oregon and Washington coasts contain hundreds of smaller communities: Seaside, Astoria, Newport, Aberdeen, Ocean Shores, sitting directly in the tsunami inundation zone for a full Cascadia rupture. FEMA's modeling projects 13,000 deaths, 1 million people displaced, and a recovery timeline measured in years. Those projections were built on the old depth estimates, without the Tillamook Basin, without the Vancouver Island tear, and with an incomplete picture of the Seattle Fault Zone. The actual numbers may be higher. Using 13 years of offshore sensor data, the first extended offshore monitoring of Cascadia's strain, University of Washington researchers found that the northern segment of the fault is fully locked and quiet, but the central segment is showing slow slip events and fluid movement. Slow slip events are episodes of silent, gradual movement along a locked fault, occurring over days or weeks, too slow to produce shaking, but detectable only by highly sensitive instruments. Scientists are still working to understand whether the slow slip is releasing energy harmlessly or redistributing it onto locked segments where it can only escape in a major earthquake. That question does not yet have an answer. What it has is a context. In 2026, the Cascadia subduction zone is simultaneously better understood and more uncertain than at any previous point in seismological history. The plate is shallower. The basin is hidden beneath Tillamook. The plate is tearing near Vancouver Island. The Seattle Fault is more active than the national model assumed. The central segment is showing movement that nobody fully understands yet, and the last full rupture was 326 years ago. Oregon's Department of Emergency Management has published estimates of what a full Cascadia rupture means for its coastal communities. 5 to 7 minutes of shaking, tsunami waves up to 100 feet high, coastal populations isolated into islands by landslides, liquefaction, and infrastructure collapse, with no road access in or out for days, weeks, or longer. The department expects that when this event occurs, Oregon will be without services and assistance for at least 2 weeks. That estimate was made before the 2026 revisions to the hazard models. The data has changed. The hazard has not gone down. The clock has not stopped. And the 326-year gap between the last Cascadia rupture and today is, by any measure of the geological record, not a reason for confidence. It is the longest quiet interval in the documented history of this fault. Cascadia is not a theory, it is a schedule. The schedule does not have a date on it, but the data released in 2026 has made one thing clearer than it has ever been. The models scientists used to describe what happens when the schedule arrives were missing information that changes the picture in every direction that matters. Subscribe to Seismic Alert. We will keep watching what builds offshore.